The morning the mules arrived was a Tuesday, the 19th of October, 1988. I remember the date because the frost was so hard it looked like a layer of sugar spilled across the pastures, and the air had that particular clean ache to it that means the last of autumn is over and a cold is settling in for good. The sky was the colour of old tin. A single hawk was making slow circles over the north woodlot, waiting for some field mouse to get brave. I was on my second cup of coffee, looking out the kitchen window, when I saw the headlights of the stock truck turning off the county road and starting the long, slow climb up our lane. It was an old International, rattling and smoking, and I knew it was him. I paid the man from the dispersal sale $100 to haul them the 60 miles from the state line, which was probably more than the truck was worth. My wife Helen came and stood beside me, wiping her hands on her apron.
She didn't say anything for a long time, just watched the truck groan its way up the grade. Finally, she asked a question that had been hanging in the air for a week. "Are you sure about this, John?" I told her I wasn't sure of much these days, but I was sure about this. It wasn't a very convincing answer, even to my own ears. The truck finally ground to a halt by the loading chute next to the barn, and the driver, a tired-looking man in a greasy cap, climbed out and spat on the ground. "This is it," he said, not as a question. "Where do you want 'em?" We walked to the back of the truck, and he unlatched the gate. One by one, they came down the ramp. 12 of them, logging mules. They weren't the handsome, spirited kind you see in pictures. They were big, rangy, and tired. Their coats were dull and shaggy, already thick for winter. They had scars on their flanks and rope galls on their shoulders.
Their ears were long and expressive, and they drooped a little as they took in their new surroundings. Their eyes, though, were what you noticed. They were dark and deep, and they seemed to be weighing everything, from the frost on the ground to the hawk in the sky to the man who had just bought them. They looked old. They looked used up. The auctioneer had called them obsolete, a matched set of 12 living antiques. The bidding had been slow, almost pitiful. The loggers there were all running skidders and forwarders, big diesel machines that could pull a whole tree out by the roots. Nobody had any use for a dozen hay burners, as one man put it. I got them for $150 a head, less than scrap price. The man selling them was the son of the logger who had passed, a young man who wanted nothing to do with his father's old ways. He seemed relieved when I made the final bid, like I was taking a burden off his hands. The mules milled around in the holding pen, their breath pluming in the cold air. They didn't fight or shove. They moved like a single organism, a slow, deliberate creature with 12 heads and 48 hooves. They were quiet. The only sound was the soft shuffle of their feet on the hard ground and the occasional snort. "They're all yours," the driver said, handing me a damp receipt. "Good luck." He didn't say it unkindly, but there was a note of pity in his voice. He took my money, climbed back into his rattling truck, and was gone in a cloud of blue smoke, leaving me alone with my purchase. Helen came out of the house with my heavy coat. "They're bigger than I thought," she said. She wasn't a farm girl, but she'd learned the economics of the place better than I had. She saw 12 new mouths to feed through a long winter, on hay we were already running short on. "They're strong," I said. I opened the gate and let them out into the 5-acre pasture behind the barn. They walked out slowly, heads down, smelling the frozen grass. They didn't run or kick up their heels. They just spread out in a loose line and began to graze, as if they'd been doing it here their whole lives. They paid me no mind. It was a strange kind of confidence they had, not arrogance, but a deep, settled knowledge of what they were. They were mules. They were built for one thing, to pull heavy things over difficult ground, and they knew it, even if no one else did. I leaned on the fence and watched them until the sun was fully up, burning the frost off the high spots. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. John Anderson had gone and bought a whole circus train of mules. He was going to start giving mule-drawn hay rides for the tourists. He'd gone soft in his old age, spending good money on sentiment. I knew what they were saying, and in a way, they weren't wrong. It looked like sentiment. It looked like foolishness.
I didn't know yet what the mules knew. I didn't know what they were about to teach me. I just had a feeling, a deep-down certainty that went back to a conversation I'd had with my father on a hillside 30 years before. The land remembers, he'd always said. I was betting that the mules remembered too. The next morning, my neighbor, Miller, pulled up to the fence line. He was driving his new Ford F-250, a truck so clean you could eat off the tailgate, which meant he hadn't been doing much real work with it. Miller was a good neighbor in the practical sense. He'd help you pull a calf or lend you a tool. But he was a firm believer in the new way of doing things. If it wasn't diesel-powered and painted John Deere green or case red, he wasn't interested. He rolled down his power window, the little electric motor whirring in the quiet of the morning.
He nodded at me, then gestured with his chin toward the pasture where the mules were standing, motionless as statues in the thin sunlight. "Heard you bought yourself a team," he said. "Looks more like a parade." I walked over to his truck, pulling my gloves on. "Just 12, I said. They needed a home. Miller chewed on that for a minute. He was a man who measured everything in terms of return on investment. The idea of buying something because it needed a home was foreign to him. 12, he repeated, as if doing the math in his head. That's a lot of hay. What are you planning on doing with them? Plowing the bottom land? He said it with a straight face, but we both knew my bottom land had been no-till for 15 years. I've got a little project in mind, I said. He looked past me, up the long slope of the property to the north, toward the old orchard. It was 40 acres of hillside that hadn't been properly tended since my grandfather's time. The apple trees were mostly wild now, tangled with briars and overgrown with hardwoods that had seeded themselves over the decades, cherry and ash, and a stand of black walnut that had grown tall and straight in the protected hollows. From a distance, it just looked like a mess, a wild piece of land nobody had ever bothered to tame. "You're not thinking of trying to clear that orchard, are you?" Miller asked. "I had a fellow from the big timber company out here last spring to look at it," I told him, just to see what he'd say. This was true. A young man in a clean polo shirt and a hard hat had come out, walked the perimeter, punched some numbers into a calculator, and shaken his head. He'd been polite, full of data. "The grade's too steep for a skidder," he'd said, pointing his clipboard at the hillside. "You're looking at a 30% grade in some of those hollows, and it's all rock and clay under that topsoil. To get the timber out, you'd have to cut a road, a proper road, with culverts and gravel. You're looking at $20,000, maybe $30,000 in road work before you even fell the first tree. The standing timber wouldn't cover half of that. Your best bet," he'd concluded, "is to just leave it as a nature preserve. It's not economical to harvest." I didn't tell Miller all of that. I just said, he told me it wasn't worth the trouble. Miller nodded, satisfied. The expert with the clipboard had confirmed his own view of the world. "He's right," Miller said. "You'd spend more than you'd make. That's a place for deer and turkey, John, not for profit." He looked back at the mules. "Those things, they can't pull what a skidder can." "They don't have to," I said. "They just have to walk where a skidder can't go." Miller gave me a look that was 1 part pity and 2 parts confusion. He couldn't see the logic. He was a good man, but his imagination ran on diesel fuel. He saw the world in terms of horsepower and torque and gallons per hour. The idea of a quieter, slower, more patient kind of power didn't compute. "Well," he said, putting the truck in gear, "you'll have some pretty pasture ornaments anyway." He gave a little wave and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the cold air. I knew his version of the story would be all over the court by lunchtime. John Anderson's finally lost it.
Pay good money for a dozen useless mules to work a piece of land that a modern timber company said was worthless. I let him go. There was no point in arguing. You can't explain a feeling to a man who only trusts figures. And all I had was a feeling, a memory, and a deep-seated hunch. They all saw the problem. They saw the steep grade, the rocks, the tangled mess of the orchard. They saw 12 old animals that ate too much and produced nothing but manure. They were looking at the place with modern eyes, eyes that only see obstacles to be flattened by force. My father had taught me to look at it differently. He taught me that the land tells you how it wants to be worked if you're quiet enough to listen. And I had a feeling these mules were the best listeners I could find. They all saw 12 mouths to feed. I saw 12 sets of ears that listen and 48 hooves that pay attention. I just didn't know for sure what they were paying attention to yet.
I was betting on a ghost, on a whisper of a memory. I was betting on the quiet wisdom of my father, who was 20 years gone, and on the even quieter wisdom of the animals he had trusted. This wasn't about sentiment, not really. I want to be honest about my reasons. I'm as practical as the next man. I have a mortgage to pay and taxes that go up every year. The decision to buy those mules wasn't born from some soft-hearted desire to run a retirement home for livestock. It was a calculated risk, based on a lesson my father taught me when I was a boy, no older than 12. We were walking the fence line of that same old orchard on a hot afternoon in July. He was carrying a roll of wire and a pair of pliers, and I was carrying the post-hole digger, which felt heavier than I was. We stopped for a rest under a big shag-bark hickory at the top of the ridge, looking down across the tangled slope.
Even then it was overgrown, but you could still see the neat rows of the original apple trees, struggling for light among the volunteer hardwoods. My father wasn't a man who wasted words. He'd point at something and give it a name, and you were expected to remember. That day he pointed with his chin down into one of the hollows. "See that one?" he said. "The one with the dark bark, straight as a rifle barrel." I saw it. A black walnut, tall and proud, its canopy spreading out over everything around it. "That tree is worth more than 5 acres of corn," he said. He pointed to another, a wild cherry with a trunk as thick as my waist. "That one too. There's furniture inside that wood. Good furniture." Over the next hour, he walked me through the woods, not as a tangle of green, but as a ledger book. He showed me how to read the value in the bark, in the height of the first limb, in the straightness of the trunk. He was teaching me to see the individual trees, not just the forest.
Then we walked over to the edge of our property, where it bordered a piece of land that had been logged a few years earlier by a big out-of-state company. It was a disaster. The ground was torn up in deep ruts that had turned into eroded gullies. The creek at the bottom was choked with silt. They had taken every tree big enough to be worth cutting, leaving behind a wasteland of stumps and slash. It looked like a battlefield. My father stood there for a long time just looking. He finally shook his head. "The land remembers every scar you give it," he said. It was one of his signature aphorisms, a short, plain statement that held a world of meaning. "They came in here with machines too big for the ground," he said. "They took the money and ran, and left the land to bleed. This piece of ground won't be right again in our lifetime." We walked back to our own orchard into the cool shade. "This place," he said, gesturing to the slope around us, "it's tricky. The good trees are mixed in with the worthless ones. The ground is soft in the spring and rocky all year round. You bring a big machine in here, you'll do the same thing they did over there. You'll tear it all to pieces just to get a few good logs. You'll spend $1 to get a dime, and you'll leave a scar that never heals." I asked him how you were supposed to get the good trees out then. "You don't use force," he said. "You use patience. You use something that can feel the ground under its feet, something that can walk between the trees, not over them." He was talking about mules. Of course. He'd grown up with them. He understood their particular genius. They were patient, they were careful, and they were smart enough to find their own footing on treacherous ground. A machine doesn't know the difference between a 100-year-old walnut and a 30-year-old poplar, he told me. It just makes a road. An animal knows the path. You just have to be smart enough to let it show you. That conversation stuck with me. It was the reason I'd gone to that dispersal sale. It was the reason I'd ignored the smirks and the whispers. I wasn't just buying 12 old mules. I was buying the only tool that I believed could do the job right. I was buying a memory, a piece of my father's wisdom. That evening, after the chores were done, Helen was sitting at the kitchen table paying the bills. She had the ledger open and her brow was furrowed. "The hay bill is going to be something else this winter," she said, not looking up. "I know," I said. "Are you absolutely sure those trees are as valuable as you remember your father saying they were?" she asked. It was a fair question. Memory can play tricks on you. A boy's impression can get magnified over the years. "I'm not sure of anything," I told her, sitting down across from her. "But Dad was. He never made a bet he hadn't already figured the odds on." She closed the ledger and looked at me. "Then I hope he was right," she said. And that was that. She trusted me, but more than that, she trusted my father's memory, his reputation as a man who never undertook a foolish venture. The weight of that trust settled on my shoulders. It was one thing to be the town fool. It was another thing to fail in a way that proved my father wrong. I knew I was missing a piece of the puzzle. My father's lesson was the why. The mules were the how. But I was still missing the where. Where, exactly, was the path he was so sure about? A few weeks passed, the mules settled in, the weather turned colder, and the last of the leaves fell from the trees, carpeting the woods in a layer of brown and gold. I spent most of my time getting the barns ready for winter, banking the foundation with straw bales and checking the heaters in the water tanks. But the orchard was always there, at the edge of my thoughts. One afternoon, I was in my father's old workshop at the back of the main barn, looking for a length of heavy chain. The workshop was the one place I hadn't changed much since he'd passed. His tools still hung on the pegboard walls, their outlines traced in pencil. The air still smelled of motor oil, sawdust, and time. I was rummaging through an old wooden crate filled with clevises, pins, and rusty bolts when my hand brushed against something hard and smooth. I pulled it out. It was a ledger book, the kind with the mottled black and white cardboard cover. Its corners were soft and frayed, and the spine was held together with black electrical tape. It was stained with grease and what looked like old coffee cup rings. I opened it. The pages were filled with my father's handwriting, a neat, compact cursive, all business. It was a farm journal dating back to the late 1960s. There were records of planting dates, rainfall totals, calving weights, and notes on equipment repairs. Replace points on the Oliver plough, April 12, 1971. First cutting of hay, 1,200 bales, June 2nd, 1973. It was the simple, unadorned history of a life spent working this piece of ground. I sat down on an overturned bucket, the single bare bulb overhead casting a pool of yellow light, and turned the pages. Toward the back of the book, I found what I was looking for, a section with the heading North Slope Orchard. For about 10 pages, he had made notes. He'd catalogued the trees, not all of them, but the ones he considered valuable. There were notes on their condition, their estimated age, their potential. Black walnut number 1 by the big rock outcropping, clear trunk to 30 feet, veneer quality if it can be got out. Cherry cluster, East Hollow, at least 5 good saw logs. It was his mental ledger made real, a confirmation of the memory I had carried for so long. And then I saw it. Tucked into a sleeve in the back cover was a folded piece of paper. I carefully unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map of the orchard sketched in pencil. It wasn't to scale, but it was detailed. He had marked the major rock formations, the creek, and the locations of the most valuable trees with little X's. And across the middle of the slope, he had drawn a faint, winding, dotted line, a path that seemed to connect the stands of good timber. Along this line, he had written a single, cryptic sentence. It was underlined twice. Path is there, mules see it, and then, next to it, two words that made the hair on my arm stand up. Never dug. My heart started beating a little faster. Never dug. What did that mean? Had he planned to dig a path and never gotten around to it? Or did it mean something else? I scanned the rest of the page. In the margin near the drawing of the slope was another small note, almost an afterthought, with a question mark at the end. Solid footing 18 inches down. I read the words over and over. Path is there, mules see it, never dug. It wasn't just a statement, it felt like an instruction, a clue left behind, a piece of a conversation he had started with me 30 years ago and was only now finishing. This notebook wasn't just a record, it was a gift. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. He knew there was a way. He believed it was tied to the instincts of the animals, their ability to see a path that a human couldn't. And he suspected there was something solid just under the surface, but he'd never confirmed it. He'd left that for me. I put the notebook back in the crate because I wasn't ready, I'll own that. The discovery was so significant, so full of promise and the potential for failure, that I was afraid of it. If I went up there and dug and found nothing but rock and clay, then the whole thing, the mules, the memory, the hope, would come crashing down. It would mean my father was wrong, and I wasn't ready for that. So I closed the lid on the crate, turned off the light, and went back to my chores, the two words echoing in my mind. Never dug. It was a challenge and a promise, and I knew, sooner or later, I was going to have to pick up a shovel and answer it. The first hard frost turned into the first hard freeze, and the ground firmed up. The time for postponing was over. I spent the next 3 weeks in a slow, methodical process of preparation. I wasn't just getting the mules ready for work. I was getting myself ready, reawakening muscles and the kind of knowledge I hadn't used in decades. I started with the harness. It had come with the mules, a tangled pile of old leather stored in dusty barrels. I spent days in the workshop, taking each piece apart, cleaning it with saddle soap, and then working warm neatsfoot oil into the dry, cracked leather until it was dark and supple again. I stitched weak spots with an awl and waxed thread, my hands remembering the rhythms of the work. Each piece of the harness had a name and a function, the collar, the hames, the traces, the breeching. It was a language of its own, a technology perfected over centuries. As I worked, I felt a connection to my father and my grandfather, who had performed these same tasks in this same room. The work was quiet, repetitive, and deeply satisfying. While I worked on the harness, I let the mules get to know me. I didn't push them. Every morning and every evening, I was the one who brought them their hay and their small ration of grain. I moved among them slowly, speaking to them in a low voice. They watched me with those intelligent, cautious eyes. Mules are not like horses. They don't give their trust easily. You don't command a mule. You enter into a partnership with it. You have to prove you're worthy of their cooperation. I learned their individual habits. There was a big, dark brown mule, the clear leader, with a calm, steady presence. I started calling him Judge. There was a smaller, quicker one who was always alert, and a pair of matched sisters who were never more than a few feet apart. By the end of the third week, they would let me walk up to them in the pasture without moving away. They would lower their heads for the halter. We had an understanding. The morning I decided to go up to the orchard, the air was still and cold, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. I chose Judge.
I slipped the collar over his head, settled the heavy hames into the groove, and began buckling the rest of the harness into place. He stood perfectly still, patient, as if he knew this routine by heart. I didn't hitch him to anything. I just took hold of the lead rope and we started walking, just the two of us, up the long slope toward the north woodlot. When we reached the edge of the old orchard, I stopped. The ground immediately grew steeper, littered with rocks and tangled with old raspberry canes. I didn't guide him. I just loosened my grip on the rope and said, "All right, old man, show me." I let him choose the way. He hesitated for a moment, his long ears swiveling, taking everything in. Then he started to walk, not straight up the hill, but at an angle traversing the slope. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, placing each hoof carefully. He was following a line that wasn't visible to me. It wasn't the path of least resistance a person would choose. It wound around thickets and rock outcroppings in a way that seemed inefficient. I followed him, watching his feet. He never stumbled. He never slid. After about 200 yards, he stopped and stood, looking out over the valley. I marked the spot with a piece of surveyor's tape tied to a branch. The next day, I brought 2 more mules up, letting them wander on their own. They spread out at first, and then, as if drawn by a magnet, they converged on the same general line that Judge had taken. Over the course of a week, I brought them all up to the slope in small groups, and every time the result was the same. They would eventually find and follow this one particular invisible path. "Mules see it," my father had written. He was right. They could feel something in the ground, some difference in firmness or stability that was imperceptible to me. Now it was my turn.
I went back alone, carrying a 6-foot steel digging bar, a shovel, and a post-hole digger. I went to the spot where I'd tied the first piece of tape and drove the bar into the ground. It sank through the dark topsoil and the dense red clay beneath it. At about 20 inches, it stopped with a solid, dull thud. Not the sharp ringing clink of hitting rock, but a heavy, resonant thump. I moved 10 feet down the path the mules had laid out and tried again. Thump. Same depth. I spent the rest of the afternoon working my way along their invisible line, probing the ground every 10 or 15 feet. Every single time I hit something solid at a depth between 18 and 24 inches. My father's question echoed in my head. Solid footing 18 inches down? The answer was yes. I went back to the first spot and began to dig. I shoveled off the topsoil, then dug through the heavy clay. And then my shovel scraped against something hard. Wood. I got down on my knees and cleared the dirt away with my hands. It was the top of a log, about a foot in diameter, its surface flattened on one side. It was dark, almost black, and incredibly dense, preserved by the oxygen-poor clay. I dug wider and found another log laid right next to it, and another next to that. It was a corduroy road, an old logging road, built by laying logs side by side to create a solid base over soft or uneven ground. It had been built by my grandfather, or maybe even my great-grandfather, 100 years ago. Used to haul out the original timber before the orchard was even planted. And then it had been left, forgotten, and the forest had grown back over it, burying it under a century of leaf mold and soil. Covered it proper. It was a piece of buried history, a secret kept by the land. Never dug, my father had written, because he never had to. He trusted the mules. He knew they could feel that solid road under their feet, and he didn't need to see it to believe it was there. I sat back on my heels, the cold mud soaking through the knees of my jeans, and I looked at that dark, solid wood. It was more than a road. It was a message of faith, passed down from one generation to the next, delivered by a dozen old mules nobody wanted. I knew who I had to call, and it wasn't the young fellow with the clipboard from the big timber conglomerate. I needed someone who understood wood, not just numbers. I called Silas Black, a man who ran a small independent sawmill over in the next county. Silas was in his late 60s, a generation older than me. He specialized in high-grade hardwoods, the kind of wood that becomes furniture, musical instruments, and veneer. He was known for being brutally honest and almost impossible to impress. He'd forgotten more about timber than most people ever learn.
When I told him over the phone that I thought I had some veneer-grade walnut on a steep slope, he was quiet for a moment. "John," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I've been on your property. Your father showed me that orchard 25 years ago. It's a tangle. You can't get it out." "I think I found a way," I said. There was another long pause. "I'll be there Thursday morning," he finally said, and hung up. Thursday came, gray and spitting a light, cold rain. Silas pulled up, not in a new truck, but in a 20-year-old Dodge with a dented fender and more rust than paint. He climbed out, a tall, lean man in a worn flannel shirt and a baseball cap pulled down low. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He just nodded and said, "Let's see it." We walked up the hill, the wet leaves squelching under our boots. When we got to the bottom of the orchard, he stopped and looked up, his eyes scanning the slope with a practiced, critical gaze.
He shook his head slowly. "It's just like I remember, a mess. You bring a skidder in here, you'll ruin the whole hillside and every log you try to pull out." "We're not using a skidder," I said. "Walk with me." I led him to the path the mules had shown me. It was just a faint trail, barely visible, but I had marked it with more tape. He followed, his expression skeptical. When we got to the section of corduroy road I had uncovered, I stopped. "This is the way," I said. Silas stared at the exposed logs for a full minute, not saying a word. He crouched down, running his hand over the dark, wet wood. He stomped on it with his boot. It didn't budge. He looked at me, and for the first time, the skepticism in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else. Curiosity. "My grandfather, I think," I said, "buried and forgotten." "Not by everything," Silas murmured, looking around at the woods. I'd planned for this. I had Judge already harnessed, waiting patiently nearby, tied to a stout maple. I led Silas over to him. "This is the rest of it," I said. Silas looked the big mule up and down, his gaze just as critical as when he'd been assessing the trees. He ran a hand along Judge's back. The mule didn't flinch. I had a heavy log, a big limb of oak that had come down in a windstorm, already chained up. I hitched Judge's traces to it. The log probably weighed 1,000 pounds. I took the lines and spoke a quiet word to the mule. "Step up, Judge." The mule leaned into his collar, the traces went taut, and the big log broke free from the mud with a sucking sound. Then, with a steady, relentless power, Judge began to walk, dragging the log straight up the corduroy path. He didn't strain, he didn't slip. His big hooves found purchase on the unseen road, and he moved with an unhurried grace that was astonishing to watch. He just walked. We went 50 yards up the path. Then I had him turn and come back down. Silas didn't move the entire time. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching. He watched the mule's feet. He watched the log sliding easily over the damp leaves. He watched the way the animal responded to my voice. When I had unhitched Judge, Silas finally moved. He walked the path himself, all the way up to the top of the ridge and back down. He stopped by 3 of the biggest black walnut trees, peering at the bark, sighting up the trunks with one eye closed. The rain had stopped and the woods were silent except for the dripping of water from the branches. When he got back to where I was standing, he took off his cap and ran his hand through his grey hair. He looked at the mule, then at the uncovered road, then at me. "Veneer," he said. almost in a whisper. Every one of those big walnuts, clear, straight, veneer grade. And the cherry is exceptional. He put his cap back on and looked me square in the eye. I can't bring a machine in here. You'd never get it past the conservation district for one thing. You'd destroy that hillside. But you and these animals, you can. You can take out just the ones we mark and you won't leave a scar. He pulled a small notebook and a pencil from his shirt pocket. What's your price, he said, per board foot delivered right here to the bottom of this hill. And we stood there in the quiet, damp woods, two old men talking business, while a mule waited patiently, having already proven a point that no machine ever could. The work began in earnest after the first deep snow of December. That winter was a cold one, but the snow was a blessing.
It cushioned the ground and made the logs easier to skid. For 3 months, the old orchard became the center of my world. My days fell into a simple, powerful rhythm. I'd be up before dawn, feeding the mules their grain in the warm, steamy darkness of the barn. After a quick breakfast, I'd harness a team of 4, and we'd make the slow walk up the hill as the sun was rising, our breath and the mules pluming in the frigid air. Silas had come and marked the trees we were to take, 17 walnuts and 31 cherries, with a splash of blue paint. I felled them myself with my old steel chainsaw, taking care to drop them where they would be easy to limb and buck. The sound of the saw was a brief, sharp intrusion in the immense quiet of the winter woods. The real work, the heart of the work, was what came next. It was a silent ballet of animal power and human guidance. The mules were incredible. They seemed to understand the task instinctively. They would stand patiently as I chained up a log, and then, on a quiet command, they would lean into their collars as one, and the log would begin its slow journey down the hidden road. There was no shouting, no whipping, just a quiet partnership. They knew the path better than I did. Even under a foot of snow, they never strayed from the solid footing of the corduroy road. I learned to trust them completely, to let their deep, animal sense of the ground guide our work. Miller would sometimes drive by on the county road below, and I'm sure he could see us up there, small figures moving among the trees. From his perspective, it must have looked ancient and inefficient, a scene from another century. He couldn't hear the quiet jingle of the harness or the soft grunt of the mules as they dug in for a heavy pull. He couldn't feel the deep satisfaction of working with the grain of the land instead of against it. We worked slow, but we worked steady. By the end of February, we had a small mountain of logs stacked neatly at the bottom of the hill, ready for Silas to pick up. They were beautiful logs, straight and thick and clean. Silas came every 2 weeks with his truck and loader. He scaled each log himself, marking the board footage on his notepad. He never said much, but I could see the appreciation in his eyes. This was the kind of timber he built his business on, and he knew he was getting it in a way that no one else could. The final tally was this. We pulled out just over 18,500 board feet of prime hardwood. The walnuts all graded out as FAS veneer logs, the highest grade there is. The cherries were nearly as good. I won't tell you the exact figure on the check Silas wrote me, but it had 5 figures, and the first number wasn't a 1. It was more than the farm had cleared in the last 3 years combined. It paid for the mules 20 times over, with enough left to pay off a good chunk of the mortgage and ensure our hay barn would be full next winter. One afternoon in early March, as the snow was beginning to melt and the first signs of spring were in the air, I saw Miller's clean Ford truck slow down and pull over at the end of my lane. He got out and leaned against a fence, looking up at the orchard. I walked down to meet him. The hillside looked different now. It was thinned out, opened up to the sunlight. The remaining trees, the young walnuts, the healthy oaks, the old apple trees, had room to breathe. The ground was undisturbed. There were no ruts, no erosion.
just the faint trace of the path we had used. It looked healthy. Miller looked at the hill, then at the last of the logs waiting for pickup, then at me, who was quiet for a long time. "That orchard looks good," he said finally. "Healthier than it's looked in years." He kicked at a stone with the toe of his clean boot. "Heard you did all right on that timber." "We did okay," I said. He nodded, a small, quick gesture. It wasn't an apology, and I didn't expect one. It was something more valuable. It was an admission, a quiet concession from a man who dealt in the currency of horsepower and diesel that there was another kind of power, another kind of profit, that he hadn't been able to measure. "Well," he said, pushing himself off the fence, "looks like those hay burners earned their keep." He got back in his truck and drove away. That was it, and it was enough. It was the quiet, understated vindication that feels more real than any loud celebration. The land was unscarred. The best trees were on their way to becoming something beautiful and lasting. And the 12 old mules were in the pasture, resting, their coats shedding out in the warm spring sun. They had more than earned their keep. They had proven my father right. That night, I took his old ledger out to the workshop. I opened it to the hand-drawn map. Below his underlined words, "Never dug," I took a pencil from the workbench and added a note of my own. 2 words. Dug. It was there. My father had left a question hanging in the air for decades, and now it had been answered. The land remembers every scar you give it. He was right about that. But I've learned it remembers every kindness too. It remembers the light touch, the patient method. There's always an old way, a quiet way, that the fast world has forgotten. A wisdom buried just under the surface, waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. If you've got your own piece of stubborn ground, or an old tool, or a piece of wisdom from your own father or grandfather that everybody else has given up on, I'd like to hear about it. Let me know in the comments. And subscribe if this meant something to you.